Prepare for a rude awakening.
Shalom, Torah fans. This is Michael Rood on the Golan Heights in Israel, and we are overlooking the beautiful Sea of Galilee. In our last episode, I introduced Dead Sea Scrolls scholar Nehemia Gordon from Jerusalem. I asked him to make sense of the conflict that we see in nearly every page of the Gospels, the ongoing battle between Yahshua and the Pharisees. Nehemia has a truly unique perspective on this conflict because he was raised in the Pharisaic tradition as a modern Orthodox Jew. His father and his father's fathers for 30 generations have been Pharisee rabbis. Nehemia understands the conflict between Yahshua and the rabbis because he found himself in conflict with the same teachings of his rabbis. We learned that the arguments that developed as Yahshua taught in the synagogues around the Galilee were never issues of Yahshua breaking the Torah. Rather, the disputes were caused by his blatant disregard for the man-made rules and regulations of the religious leaders. Yahshua deliberately broke the rules of the religious establishment of his day to illustrate the foundational commandment that underpins all Scripture. No one is ever allowed to add to or subtract one single commandment from the Torah. No one, not even the Messiah himself, has that authority. Now, Nehemia continues his address with the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer in Episode 5 in the 10-part series, Raiders of the Lost Book, Discoveries in the Ancient Hebrew Text of Matthew's Gospel.
One day, one of my rabbis sat down and he said, "Enough of questioning the authority of the rabbis, Nehemia. You must accept their authority." And he began to tell me a very famous story, the story of Rabbi Eliezer, which is a foundational story in rabbinical theology. And the story of Rabbi Eliezer, it's told in the Babylonian Talmud, and it goes as follows. Rabbi Eliezer was the greatest of the sages of his era. He was actually the teacher of Rabbi Akiva, who's maybe one of the most famous rabbis that ever lived. So you can imagine how great Rabbi Eliezer was. And one day, Rabbi Eliezer is in the rabbinical academy, and he's having a debate with all the other rabbis in some minutia of rabbinical law about whether a certain type of oven is ritually clean or ritually unclean. And Rabbi Eliezer says that oven is ritually clean, and all the other rabbis say it's ritually unclean. And Rabbi Eliezer is trying to convince the other rabbis he's right. He's one, and he's against this mass of other rabbis. And the Talmud explains that on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forth every argument in the world, and he couldn't convince the other rabbis that he was right. Couldn't convince them he was right. He brought forth scriptural arguments and rational arguments, and he couldn't convince them he was right. He doesn't know what to do. He's getting very frustrated. And finally he says, I know what I can do to convince them. I'm going to invoke a miracle. And Rabbi Eliezer shouts out and he says, if I'm right, let the trees prove it. And at that moment, they heard the snapping of wood, and all the rabbis ran outside, and they saw an entire orchard of trees being ripped from the roots and flying up in the air, and they looked at this and they said, this is a miraculous occurrence. Rabbi Eliezer has invoked a miracle to prove he's right, and the miracle has come to pass. And they look at this miracle, and they turn to Rabbi Eliezer, and they say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to trees. Oh boy, what's he going to do? You don't listen to trees, I just brought a miracle. So he says, okay, maybe we're not quite understanding each other here. And he says, let's try this again. I'm going to invoke a second miracle. If I'm right, let the river prove it. And at that moment, they heard the rushing of the water. It was a very great river. And they run outside, and they see this mighty river begin to flow backwards, and they look at this and they say, this is a miracle. A second miracle has now been invoked that Rabbi Eliezer has brought to prove he's right. We're very impressed, and they turn to Rabbi Eliezer and they say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to rivers. He's brought two miracles, and they're not listening to what he's saying. He's brought scriptural arguments and rational arguments and two miracles, and they won't listen to him. So finally, in desperation, he yells out and he says, if I'm right, let the walls of the academy prove it. And at that moment, they heard the walls begin to shake and rumble. And the Talmud explains that the walls came to a 45-degree angle, collapsing in. Of course, if they'd fallen in the entire way, the story would have ended right here. And the rabbis look at these walls and realize they've almost been killed by these falling walls, and they turn to Rabbi Eliezer and they say, wow, 3 miracles. Now we're really impressed. This can't be a coincidence. This is clearly a series of miraculous events. They turn to Rabbi Eliezer and say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to walls. He doesn't know what to do. 3 miracles, and they won't accept his opinion. They won't accept these proofs that he's right. And finally, in utter desperation, he calls out and he says, if I'm right, let heaven prove it. And at that moment, they heard the crack of thunder, followed by a voice.
Why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer? In all matters, the law agrees with him.
And by the way, that's an actual recording that was made at the time. They've heard this voice calling out from heaven, saying, Rabbi Eliezer's right, why are you arguing with him? And they hear this and they're very impressed, and they turn to Rabbi Eliezer and they say, scriptural evidence and 3 miracles, and God calling down from us from heaven, telling us you're right. And they turn to him and say, we're very impressed, but sorry, we don't listen to heaven. And as my rabbi was telling me this story, he opened up actually me to the book of Deuteronomy, to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 12, and there it actually says concerning the Torah that the Torah is not in heaven. It is not in heaven. And this is the words that the rabbis said to Rabbi Eliezer, and they explained to him that God has no say in interpreting Scripture because the Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is here on earth, and the rabbis are the ones who have exclusive authority to interpret Scripture. God has no say in it. And my rabbi turned to me as he was telling me the story, and he said, you see, Nehemia? God himself can't question the interpretation of the rabbis. So who are you to question their interpretation? And as I was hearing this, I was in shock. And I have to tell you, for years I struggled with the oral law. It was very difficult for me because my father was a rabbi, and many of my ancestors were prominent rabbis. The man after whom I'm named, Nehemia, was a famous rabbi in Chicago. And for me to break from this oral law, which had been the heritage of my ancestors, was very difficult for me. And for years I struggled with this, and I had doubts, and I wasn't sure. But when I heard the story, I turned to my rabbi, and I thanked him, and I said, now I know this is not of God. Now, the story actually has a continuation. It gets worse. The Talmud goes on. My rabbi didn't tell me this part, but later I read this directly out of the Talmud. And it tells about how later on, after the face-off between Rabbi Eliezer and the other rabbis, one of the rabbis named Rabbi Natan was wandering through the forest, and who does he meet in the forest? He meets the prophet Elijah. And of course, the rabbis believe that Elijah never died. If you've ever been to a rabbinical Passover Seder, one of the things that you'll notice very prominently, they'll stop in the middle of telling the story of the Exodus, and they'll open up the door to let Elijah in. Well, Rabbi Natan, according to the Talmud, actually met Elijah, and he said to him, Elijah, when we said to God that the Torah is not in heaven, and by the way, if you look at that passage where it says it is not in heaven, and you read 2 verses earlier, what it's actually saying in the context is, the Torah is not too difficult for you. It's saying there you have no excuse not to keep the Torah. It's not too difficult. It's not across the sea or in heaven that you have some excuse to say, I need someone to go up to heaven to get it for me. The Torah is not too difficult. That's what it actually says in Deuteronomy 30, but the rabbis only take those 5 words out of context. And Rabbi Natan asked Elijah, what did God mean what was God's reaction when we said the Torah is not in heaven? And Elijah explains, according to the Talmud, that at that moment God laughed and said, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. And this appears in the Babylonian Talmud, the tractate of Baba Metzia, page 59b. And the point of the story is, I don't believe that God actually said those words, as the Talmud claims. But the point of the story in the Talmud is whether the words were said or not, is that the rabbis have vanquished God, that the rabbis have absolute authority on earth to interpret Scripture, and the rabbis have defeated God in this sense. He has no say in how Scripture is to be interpreted on planet Earth. In heaven, he can say whatever he wants, but down here on earth, the rabbis have absolute authority. And this is a fundamental principle of Phariseeism, that you really can't understand Phariseeism without understanding this concept. Now, we're beginning to see a problem here, because in Matthew 23, Yahshua seems to be upholding this concept. He's saying the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. They have Mosaic authority. Whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Whatever they command you to do, you better do it. What's going on here? Well, the third principle of Phariseeism is what I call irrational interpretation. The rabbis don't call it that. They call it midrashic interpretation. This is sometimes translated into English as homiletical or hermeneutical interpretation. And what it does is it systematically ignores the language and context of Scripture. And the principle behind this method of interpretation, or this approach, is that Scripture is a divine code. And only the rabbis have the knowledge and authority and tools to decipher that divine code. And we've already seen an example of that with the words, "it is not in heaven," from Deuteronomy 30. The rabbis took only those words, "it is not in heaven," out of the context, disembodied them from the context, and imbued them with the meaning that was never intended, that God has no authority in how to interpret Scripture. Now let's look at another example, a classic example of midrashic interpretation or rational interpretation. Exodus 23, verse 2. There we read in the Torah, "You shall not go after the majority to do evil, neither shall you testify in a matter of strife to incline after the majority to pervert justice." And what this means is that you must not follow what the majority says just because the majority says it. You must follow the truth, even if you're the only one doing that. And if you're testifying in a court case, you must not say that a certain person is guilty just because everybody says he's guilty. You must testify the truth, even if you're the lone voice of reason, because to do otherwise would be a perversion of justice. Now, this is a very, very important commandment in the Torah, that we must follow the truth, and not the majority, not to be sheeple, follow after the herd. But the rabbis take this verse, and of course they have the absolute authority on earth to interpret Scripture, and using this authority, Scripture being a divine code, they arbitrarily take off words from the beginning and words from the end, and what they're left with is the principle, incline after the majority. And in fact, this is a very important principle in Phariseeism. When there was this debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, why was it so important for Rabbi Eliezer to convince the other rabbis that he was right? Why couldn't he just say, "I'm a very wise man, you're very wise men, let's agree to disagree"? Why did he have to invoke miracles and have God calling out from heaven? Why couldn't they just agree to disagree? Because the rabbis said to Rabbi Eliezer that you must incline after the majority. They said to him in Exodus 23:2, "It has already been written that you must incline after the majority. We're the majority, you have to accept our opinion." That's why it was so important for him to convince them. If he can't convince them, he has to accept this opinion that he knows to be factually untrue. Now, what's wrong with this? Who's to say Scripture's not a divine code? That's what the rabbis would respond. They'd say, okay, we're taking these words out of context, but that's the original intent that God had when he gave the Torah. Who's to say Scripture's not a divine code? Well, I know Scripture's not a divine code because it tells us in Deuteronomy exactly how to interpret Scripture. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 12, it describes there a commandment that the Torah must be read out loud in a public reading, and there we're told, "Gather the nation, the men, the women, the children, and the sojourner in your gate, in order that they hear, and in order that they learn, and fear Yehovah your God, and diligently do all the words of this Torah." And the purpose of this public reading every seventh year of the entire Torah, from Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy, is so that Israelites would hear the Torah. By hearing the Torah, they would learn the Torah, and by learning the Torah, they would know to do the Torah. Now, it goes on in verse 13, and it explains, "And their children who did not know," that 7-year-old boy who's never heard the Torah before, it's his first time, "their children who did not know, they shall hear and learn to fear Yehovah your God." Now, this is very important, because what this means is that the way the ancient Israelites learned Torah was by hearing it. And actually, this is the way that God intended that the Torah be understood. By coming every 7th year and hearing it in the public reading, someone who's never heard Torah before, someone who does not know, will simply learn it by hearing it. Now, once we realize that you can't take 5 words out of context, "it is not in heaven," because when I'm hearing it, I'm hearing the entire passage. I'm hearing the entire verse. I can't take 2 verses here and 3 words there and a half a verse here and proof text myself into an entire theology. I have to actually read Scripture within its context and look at all the evidence and all the context, not just taking a few words here and a few words there. Because that's what the ancient Israelites would have understood and heard when they heard the Torah read out loud every 7th year. Now, why is it that they had to hear the Torah? Why couldn't they simply sit in their houses and read Torah like we do today? Why did they have to actually hear it out loud and come all the way to Jerusalem every 7th year? Well, the reason for that is that the average ancient Israelite did not have a copy of the Torah in his house. It took great wealth and resources to have a copy of the Torah in your house. And in fact, there's a specific law in Deuteronomy 17 that the Messiah anointed king of Israel must write for himself a copy of the Torah. And the reason he must write for himself a copy of the Torah is that if he doesn't write for himself a copy of the Torah, he won't have one. He can't go to the store and buy one for $3. If he doesn't write it out letter for letter, word for word, he simply won't have one. And if he doesn't have one, he can't reign as a righteous king. As a righteous king of Israel, he has to have the Torah at his side at all times. And that's why Deuteronomy 17 is a specific law commanding the king to write a copy of the Torah. Now, again, did it take such great resources to make a copy of the Torah? Let's remember, in ancient times, if I wanted a copy of the Torah, I had to start off with an entire flock of sheep that I could slaughter in order to make parchment. Not everybody could afford to do this. I had to have barrels and barrels of ink in order to actually write the Torah. And bear in mind, you couldn't go in ancient times to Office Depot and say, I need 30 barrels of ink. You had to actually have someone go out and produce the ink and produce the barrels. This was a whole industry just to write one book. And finally, maybe the most expensive part is you had to have a scribe sit for at least a year and sit and copy letter for letter, word for word, in order to have a copy of the Torah for yourself. So the average Israelite simply did not have a copy of the Torah. He didn't have the wealth or the resources to produce a copy of the Torah. And the Creator knew this, and that's why he took into account and said that the way the average Israelites will learn Torah, the simple shepherd and farmer, is by simply hearing it every seventh year. Now, once we realize this, we realize that the way Scripture is intended to be understood is by looking at the language and the context. And that's key to understanding the correct interpretation of Scripture, looking at the language and the context. Now, this is actually a big challenge for us. We can't just show up every seventh year and hear it because we have certain challenges the ancient Israelites did not have. First challenge we have is a linguistic challenge, the language. The Torah is not written in King James English. It's actually written in Biblical Hebrew. Now, the problem is that nobody today in the world speaks Biblical Hebrew. I've lived in Israel for 12 years and I'm fluent in modern Hebrew, and I actually read Biblical Hebrew fluently, but nobody speaks Biblical Hebrew as their native tongue. Now, to give you an idea of what the difference is, it's like the difference between the English you speak here today and the English of Chaucer. You could pick up the writings of Chaucer and you probably would understand a few words on each page, but unless you're specifically trained to read that dialect of English, you won't understand what Chaucer is saying. And that's the challenge we have with Biblical Hebrew. We have to understand the language as it was originally spoken 3,500 years ago. The language that was spoken by the ancient Israelite shepherds and farmers that could simply show up and hear the Torah read and understand it. So we have to work a lot harder than they did. And that's part of what it means to be in exile, to be thrown out of the land of Israel and lose our language, be scattered throughout the world. These are the things that we have to deal with being in exile. Now, this next thing we have to look at is the context. And we've already talked about textual context. That is, I can't just take the words, it is not in heaven, and disembody them from the context. I have to look at the entire passage, or I'm twisting what Scripture says. And there's also a historical context. Let me illustrate what I mean by this historical context by an example. 3 times in the Torah we're commanded, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. 3 times that appears, word for word, jot for jot, tittle for tittle, the exact same commandment 3 times. 3 times. Now, the rabbis, of course, look upon Scripture as a divine code, and when they hear 3 times, Exodus 23, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Exodus 34, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Deuteronomy 14, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. They hear that 3 times, and they say Scripture is a divine code. And when codes have repeated things, it's to encode extra hidden meaning. And when it appears the same commandment 3 times, that actually indicates that 3 different things. And what are the 3 different things this indicates? Of course, only the rabbis have the authority to interpret what these 3 things are. The first one, according to the rabbis, is you shall not eat meat and milk together. The second time it says you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, what it really means is you shall not cook meat and milk together. And the third time it appears, it means you shall not even benefit from meat and milk cooked together. What do they mean by benefit? You may not even feed it to your dog. Well, that's how the Pharisees, the rabbis, look at it. When I hear 3 times that the Creator tells me you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, I first ask the question, what would the ancient Israelite shepherd or farmer have understood if he heard these exact words repeated 3 times? If he was that boy, that 7-year-old boy who knew nothing. Deuteronomy 31, verse 13, he didn't know anything. What would he have understood? And I come to the conclusion after a linguistic and textual analysis that what I would understand from hearing this 3 times is, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's very clear. It has nothing to do with meat and milk. Now, today we know that's correct. We know that's the correct interpretation because archaeologists have uncovered ancient documents written by the Canaanites from a city in Syria called Ras Shamra, which has ancient Canaanite writings. And there the Canaanites talk about how they have a fertility rite where they would boil a kid in the milk of its mother as a fertility rite for one of their goddesses. And so today we know that the reason the Torah forbade us from partaking in this pagan practice, or forbade us from boiling a kid in the milk of its mother is that this was an ancient pagan fertility custom or sacrifice, and that's why the Torah doesn't say don't eat meat and milk together or don't boil meat and milk together, because it's not talking about that. It's talking about a very specific pagan fertility sacrifice of boiling a kid in the milk of its mother. It's not even a dietary law. It's a pagan sacrifice we're forbidden from partaking in. And every ancient Israelite shepherd or farmer would have known this. They interacted with the Canaanites, and they knew these pagans. They knew their ways, and they knew that they were sacrificing kids in the milk of their mothers, and the Torah is coming to forbid them from doing that. And that's the difference between interpreting Scripture as a divine code and interpreting Scripture actually in its context, according to its language, and according to its historical context. And what this teaches us is that we have to use archaeology and history in order to uncover and try to get a better picture and understanding of what the Torah is commanding us. Now, that's the third principle of Phariseeism. The fourth principle of Phariseeism is sanctified tradition. And in Hebrew, this is called minhag, or custom. And there's a principle in Phariseeism, minhag Yisrael Torahi, a custom of Israel is law. And what that means is that a custom done over and over by an Israelite or Jewish community over time becomes sanctified and it becomes an actual law. So I mentioned today that I'm dressed as a modern-day Pharisee. I don't actually dress normally this way. I'm dressed in the garb of a modern-day Pharisee to illustrate to you what it would mean to obey the Pharisees. And this is actually a sanctified outfit, a tradition that's been sanctified over time. And if you go to Jerusalem or New York or certain parts of Chicago, you'll see people all over dressed like this because they're following the sanctified tradition of their ancestors. Now, what do we mean by a sanctified tradition? Or the classic example of a sanctified tradition is wearing the head covering. And right now I'm going to illustrate to you what it would mean not to follow the traditions of the Pharisees, the sanctified traditions. We're going to peel away some of these man-made laws, some of these sanctified traditions. I'm going to take off the hat, because this is a traditional Pharisee hat. I'm going to take off the hat and peel away a layer of tradition. And now I'm left wearing the kippah, the skull cap. And the kippah is a tradition that's been sanctified over the last approximately 800 years. 1,000 years ago, there was no such thing as Jews wearing kippahs. Didn't exist. There was no such custom like that. Approximately over the last 800 years, this custom has been sanctified over time. And today it's been so sanctified that there's an actual law that, with its own rules and regulations that the Pharisees teach that you must wear the skull cap if you're a male. And this is described in the Shulchan Aruch, which we've seen before as the modern universally accepted guide to Pharisaical living. And there it says about the kippah, the skull cap, one may not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head. So this is not just a folk custom, oh, I feel Jewish if I wear a kippah. No. If you wear the kippah, you're following this man-made law that's been sanctified over time and now is taken on its own rules and regulations. One may not walk 4 cubits with an uncovered head. Let's see how that would work. So I'm going to take off my kippah, peel away another layer of tradition, and we're going to see what this means. Okay, so if I'm following this sanctified tradition, I can walk 1 cubit, and I can walk a 2nd cubit, and a 3rd cubit, and if I walk that 4th cubit, then I am violating the laws of the Pharisees, this sanctified tradition. There's another law there in the Shulchan Aruch concerning the head covering, and there it says, it is forbidden to pray with an uncovered head. Well, that's very interesting, and I think that matter speaks for itself. But what you can see here is this is not just a folk custom or tradition. This is something that has been sanctified over time and now is taken on its own rules and regulations. Well, what's wrong with that? Many people will say, well, it makes me feel good to wear a kippah. It makes me feel more Jewish, not just to wear the kippah, the skull cap, but to follow all these different traditions. Even if I'm not Jewish by extraction, I feel good following these traditions. It makes me feel closer to the ancient roots. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with adding new commandments, with sanctifying these traditions? What's wrong with it is that the Torah specifically forbids us from doing this. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, it says, you shall not add unto the matter which I command you today, nor shall you diminish anything from it, to keep the commandments of Jehovah your God, which I am commanding you. There's a specific prohibition in the Torah from adding to the Torah. So if we add these man-made laws, if we follow these sanctified traditions, we are partaking in adding to the Torah. Now it's very interesting here because in the same breath that it forbids us from adding to the Torah, it forbids us from taking away from the Torah. So to follow one of these sanctified traditions is no different than abolishing the Sabbath. adding the Torah and taking away. Those are both a violation of this fundamental law in the Torah of adding or taking away from the Torah. Now, this appears a second time. There's a second witness to this. Deuteronomy 12:32. All that I am commanding you shall diligently do. You shall not add to it or diminish from it. You must not add to the Torah or take away from the Torah. And the question becomes, if you follow these man-made laws, these sanctified traditions, who are you obeying? Who are you being obedient to? Are you being obedient to our Creator, or are you following these man-made laws which are in addition to the Torah? This appears a third time. Proverbs 30 verse 6. There we're told, do not add unto his words, lest he reprove you and you be found a liar. I don't want God calling me a liar. I don't want any part of that.
In our next episode, Nehemia will sum up the 5 foundational principles of Phariseeism, or as he affectionately calls them, the 5 iniquities of the rabbis, from which they developed a religious system which many times ignores the Torah. Join us again next time for episode 6 in the 10-part series, Raiders of the Lost Book, Discoveries in the Ancient Hebrew Text of Matthew's Gospel. This is Michael Rood in the Galilee, bidding you shalom, peace, and I will see you when the smoke clears.